said, I'm the multimedia specialist for the Chesapeake Bay program. I spend my time about split 50-50 working on photo and video projects. And I'm going to talk to you today about photography in particular as it relates to visual storytelling. I feel sorry for anybody who's calling in but not sharing the webinar screen, because I'm going to show a lot of pictures today. And we're going to talk about some of my own background, some of the photo history from the past 150 years, and how we do things at the Bay program, and the general guidelines governing both taking photos and using them effectively. So there's going to be a lot to cover. So in my job at the Bay program, I use visual storytelling in a sense to introduce the Chesapeake watershed to itself, to show communities in relation to their environment, and to share the stories of people who care about that environment, so that other people hopefully can internalize those stories, gain some empathy along the way, and start to care in their own right. And for me, visual storytelling is just the strongest way to tell a story with emotional impact, so that people might learn something and perhaps challenge their own preconceptions and be inspired to learn more and do more on their own. So a lot of the people at the Bay program have told me that I have the coolest job, and I definitely agree that it's pretty great. I do spend I do spend a lot more time in the office than people tend to think, especially this time of year because it's cold. But when I do get out, it's a lot of fun. But it's not always going out and stumbling onto amazing scenes right away. A lot of time it takes some work to find the thread of a story that will have some strong visual impact. So this is a picture of me up at the very top of the Chesapeake watershed in Madison County, New York. I was visiting farms with Troy Bishop, who works at the Soil, Water, and Conservation District up there. And if you know Bishop, you might know that he goes by the name the Grass Whisperer because of his passion for grazing. And so he's got this great message about pasture health being good both for cows and your farming business, as well as reducing runoff into streams. So I knew I wanted this engaging personality in a video. The only problem was that watching grass grow is the very definition of being boring. So there's this inherent challenge. And anyway, I'm touring this farm with the Grass Whisperer, and he starts talking about cow pies. And it turns out that he uses them as an indicator of the health of the animal and how healthy cow pies fit in with healthy pasture. And it got me really excited. You probably can't really tell in this photo, but I'm on cloud 9 right here, because I found the picture I need to make that connection in a way that I think will be just as surprising enough to get an emotional reaction, whether you're into cow pies or not. And I wanted to actually switch gears a little bit and tell you a little bit about my background, how I got to this point, how I got to be this guy that gets excited about cow pies out in the middle of a field in New York. I studied biology in my undergrad at the University of California in San Diego. I started freelancing as a photographer, and then I went back to school, to grad school at Ohio University, and that's where I learned photojournalism. I learned how to make videos, and I started doing more stories about environmental issues. So this first one is actually one I did in grad school, but I actually went back to San Diego to produce a photo essay on this international water pollution issue, where runoff from these canyons in the Tijuana River watershed are sending trash, pollution, raw sewage across the border, and contaminating popular surf spots in San Diego County. So you'll start to get a sense of my approach. You see a lot of people. These are people who, through the written portion of the story, their voices appear. This is a type of photo I call sense of place. That's an important part of a lot of environmental stories. This was actually before the time of drones, so it's on a it's actually on a remote control airplane instead of the drones that you see buzzing around nowadays. So it's a bit cutting edge. This is the community of Los Laureles in Tijuana. It's a lot of informal development on steep cliff sides where every time it rains, the water starts peeling off all this trash, and it just shoots it right across the border. You might recognize some impervious pavers. They work. This nonprofit works to install them in Los Laureles in Tijuana. I'm going to flip through quickly because I feel like we're going to have a lot more to cover. There's another story on acid mine drainage in southeast Ohio. This is water pollution that's the legacy of mining laws that didn't require mines to reclaim the mines once they abandoned them. So you got these empty voids underground where the water seeps through, leaches out minerals, becomes acidic, and then precipitates out this orange rust above ground, and basically kills everything in the stream. So after grad school, I interned at a couple newspapers. Still interested in nature stories. I followed a man who was a veteran of the first Persian Gulf War, experienced traumatic brain injury, and years later found that rehabilitating birds of prey was a way that he could rehabilitate himself, basically. So I followed him. So he volunteered at the Audubon, visited the VA. This is in the VA parking lot. He found a hawk on the street light. So you might start to see that some of these photos, it's not like I set out that day, like, oh, I need a photo of my subject in the VA parking lot looking at a hawk. It's the serendipitous moments that come from spending a lot of time with your subject.
Hey, Will, there was one question that came in. Do you ever pose your shots, or are all of them candid? I think you may have just touched on that a little bit, but did you want to expand on that at all?
Sure. That's a good question. So everything you see is candid unless it's immediately apparent that it's a portrait situation. So things like this, this is after talking with him, and he's telling me about this feather that he carries around from I think it was a peregrine falcon, that he's allowed to keep. He got permission to keep it, and it's one of those things that keeps him motivated. A lot of it is being anticipating moments, being ready for them. If I know that he's looking through his telescope a lot, so these are things that I can prepare for. Doing yoga, like being ready to catch emotional reactions as they come. That's how photojournalists do their job. That's how you take photos ethically. If you stage things, that's something that can get you fired from a news publication, because it goes against codes of ethics. You're not supposed to deceive people into thinking that a staged moment is real. But I'll say I don't have the little chat box up on my screen as I'm looking at my notes. So if you have a question, you might just shout at me. I'm happy to stop and answer anything.
Yeah, and I'll make sure I read them so I can let you know. Well.
Great. So let's see. Okay, that reminds me. I'm gonna look. So that's some of the work that I did before the Chesapeake Bay program. I just wanted to flip through some of my favorite photos from my time with the Chesapeake Bay program. Blue crabs, obviously. This was one of the first photos I made within a couple months of getting to the Bay program. I was struck by the human element, the fact that the woman's painted nails were the same colors as the blue crab's carapace. Hunting on the eastern shore, tadpoles near the Susquehanna, a farm that
Hey, Will, I
uses...
think we're having a delay in your photos.
Oh, sure. I'll try to slow down a little bit.
Yeah, it still has you taking a picture of the cow pie on our screen.
Oh, really? Oh, no.
Yeah. Um,
How about now?
mm, looks like it's
Is it still frozen?
on that one. Yeah. Is it in PowerPoint?
I switched. It's not in PowerPoint. It's just my browser. And actually, the PowerPoint's not even on my phone.
Okay. It's now the Bay Program homepage.
Okay.
Oh, now it seems to be.
Is it caught up?
Yeah. Now we see. Yeah, it may just have to take a little, just go a little slower. But yeah, we see the crab with the girl with the nails now.
Did you see a crab?
Yeah, we see the crab right now.
Okay. Cool. Do you see a hunter?
Not yet. We see tadpoles.
Oh wow, it's really lagging. Well, I'm gonna switch back to the PowerPoint and see if that.
Farm. Okay, yeah, that might work.
Okay. I guess it doesn't like if I switch my screen. So the stuff I produce, it shows up on ChesapeakeBay.net, where it populates stories on the blog, and those images that might initially appear in a blog post, they might work their way into the static part of the website, and we also have an archive of pretty close to 10,000 original images, which is available on our Flickr page, which are available for non-commercial use. So there's a good amount of recycling of our archive that I'm pretty happy about. Like I said, I also do videos. You can find those on the website. And on a daily basis, I post to Instagram. We've got about 2,800 followers at this point. I'm going to try one more time because I wanted to show some of our more popular photos. Let me see if this works. Hold on. No.
Yeah, we see the hunter photo now, which is really cool. Really dramatic.
Okay. You see a hunter? Let me see if I can get...
Yeah, we see the hunters now.
Do you see blue crabs?
Mm-mm.
Okay, I'm going to give up on this.
It's now back on the website.
Okay.
See your most recent videos.
Yeah.
Oh, there's the Insta. Yeah, I think it's just really lagging. We may just want to do the PowerPoint. I don't know if it's going to go back and forth between the other stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, we good? Do you see a map?
I think it's still lagging a little bit. I think we're catching up, though. You see the Instagram. Now there's a map
There's a map now?
with orange dots on it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the overarching themes for the Instagram account is just I try and show the geographic range of the watershed. That's part of introducing the watershed to itself is getting around. So each of those orange dots represent somewhere that I've traveled, taken photos, or that we have photos in our archive from before my time at the Bay program. So today, talking about what makes photos successful makes me think of a talk I heard in college by a Pulitzer-winning photographer named Don Bartlett, who said that good photos have both style and substance. This is one of his Pulitzer-winning photos from this great story. He covered basically the journey that undocumented immigrants make traveling across Mexico to get to the United States. He traveled the journey himself, took photos. And when it comes to style and substance...
Hey, Will, I think it's still lagging. I think what you may need to do is you close out everything and then stop your screen share and then start your screen share again, because I think it's just really behind right now.
Okay.
Because we're still taking the Hunter photo.
Gotcha.
Unfortunately. Let's try and reset it. I think that'll do it.
Let me see if closing out this stuff helps.
Yeah, and I would just turn off your screen share and then start it again, I think is probably...
Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we see the Chesapeake Bay Instagram page right now.
Oh, come on. That's not even, I don't even have that up anymore.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have your PowerPoint by any chance that you could send to me and I could put it on here really quick?
No, I'd have to download it, but let me let me try one more time.
Oh, okay, so style and substance on our screen.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna not
Yay!
go away from this. um,
Sorry guys on the
so I
phone. Thanks for bearing with us.
Yeah, so I might plow through some of this background, but I wanted to kind of start, start off on this note that's been around, since photography was invented, basically. So photography in the form of this technology called the daguerreotype really became widespread in 1839. And if you recognize this individual, this is Frederick Douglass, photographed in 1841 when he was still in his early 20s. And it's interesting because he's still legally a slave at this point, and he felt that photography was very important in ending slavery and achieving civil rights. So he believed that photos had this really powerful value of truth, and that even to a racist back in the day, they could challenge some of those preconceptions, and particularly he always took on the stern expression in his photos to kind of counteract this racist caricature of like the happy slave, basically. And he actually became the most photographed man of the 19th century. So that's something that I didn't learn when I first learned photographic history. It kind of came about in recent years with some scholarship. This guy collected photos of Frederick Douglass and found like over 150 portraits. And if you think that's more than like Abraham Lincoln, for example, so it's pretty interesting. And you'll see that theme of photos conveying some idea of truth kind of just keeps on going throughout the next 150 years. But as far as nature and the environment, that sort of starts even before photography. Thomas Cole, a painter that started the Hudson River School, drew attention to a religious understanding of nature, in addition to this American quality of wonder of nature and its promotion. And that that was 1830s. Fast forward a few decades, you still sort of see it in these geological surveys that were strictly speaking, economic endeavors, not like preservationist. They were, out scouting to see, where all the arable land was, like where can people settle, basically. But it was sort of interesting that the same photographers that were promoting this sort of myth of the empty Wild West ready to settle, they also contributed photos to efforts to preserve, for example, Yellowstone, Yosemite, particularly with Yosemite, you got people in Congress using those photos to lobby bills in Congress, and like putting photos on their walls in their offices and that sort of thing. Fast forward a few decades, similar subject matter, but now you have artists like Ansel Adams, not necessarily documenting the landscape as an objective observer might see it. They're expressing their emotional perspective on landscape, like how they feel about the environment, and still using photos of a pristine landscape, but showing how pristine and amazing it is to warrant its protection. And that sort of morphs to still the sense of the environment needing attention, consideration, valuation, protection, but not necessarily showing it pristine. This is Robert Adams in the 70s. And skipping back a little bit, during the Great Depression, it was the first major government-funded documentary photography effort that came out of the Farm Security Administration. They were under this guy named Roy Stryker, who would give the photographers all sorts of books to read, talk at length about where he was going to send them. And this is a photo by Arthur Rothstein. He said, he's talking about Roy Stryker. What he always talked about was showing an individual in relation to his environment. So that's where these photos got most of their strength. And that theme sort of runs into the next major government-funded project, which is Project Documerica, which was supposed to be this big monumental effort photographing all across the United States. Unfortunately, it only lasted 6 years before it disbanded. And for the first time, it was kind of a flipping of the script from photography aiding the conquest of the West and expansion, and really looking at consequences and sort of reining in rampant environmental degradation, and especially when it comes to human health. So here are some more Project Documerica. One of my favorite photographers, Gary Winogrand, not necessarily an environmental photographer, but used photos as commentary and sometimes commentary on people's relationship to their environment. Gary Winogrand said, "Photography is not about the thing photographed, it's about how that thing looks photographed." And what you see is recognition of the medium of photography as an inherent abstraction. So what that means is when you look at a photo of, say, this man with this cow, the way the cow's looking, the brim of his hat, caught in this serendipitous moment, the shape of the cow's tongue exactly mirrors the lip of this hat, the brim of the hat. And it's these interesting little quirks that Gary Winogrand was interested in. Not necessarily a one-to-one relationship between reality and what is captured in the photograph. So what a photograph is able to do is show visual relationships, unexpected visual relationships, like here between an elephant and this guy's hand, where they're kind of on par with each other, and it shows them more closely related than you might expect. Going further in that metaphorical, non-literal realm, here's an underwater photo by Brian Scarry, National Geographic photographer. You see religious symbolism again, this being an allusion to crucifixion. Symbolism of another type, so this is a photo by Amy Vitale. At the same time, it's a photo of a specific panda breeding program, but it's also commentary on humans taking the place of nature. You might recognize Earthrise, taken in 1968 by astronaut William Anders. And I put this in not just because it's an iconic photo, but it's also one taken by a scientist on a scientific mission. So it's somebody who might not necessarily take a great photo any other day of the week, but they had this amazing experience and they're ready to capture it. So that's something to encourage anybody who doesn't consider themselves a photographer, but wants to communicate their experience. So I talk about Earthrise as an iconic image, but as things have evolved in the world of photography and the rise of social media, it's much less about iconic images nowadays, and much more about maintaining an ongoing dialogue for cumulative impact. So as an example, there's this Instagram account called Everyday Africa, and it starts as an account, it turns into a book, and this is what Stephen Mays, a visual communication strategist, how he describes sort of where this falls in terms of photography trends. He says it becomes culturally transformative when multitudes of personal experiences are displayed online, and these individual moments of sub-historic experience are aggregated to deliver a wholly new perspective on the world. So what this means for you and me is that photography is much more about the first-person experience, which you're the only person who can tell your story, and there's a lot less pressure to make iconic images as opposed to running an ongoing dialogue. So that's something that I see a lot of opportunity for people who don't necessarily want to take on photography as a profession, but still want to use it to communicate. So now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of making photos. One of the first considerations, even before you get to that step, is whether you want to be making photos or using another medium in the first place. So when I think of photography versus video versus text as as the tools that I use that that a lot of our stories end up employing in one facet or another, you tend to land on photography when you want more emotional when you have more emotional subject matter that you want to convey. If your story is one of reflection, for example, as opposed to video where there's a lot more ongoing action, you want to tell stories in the present tense and hear the voices of your subjects. And then text is really where you can convey a lot of information, give a lot of background. If things happen in the past in your story, that's sort of where the text has its strength. So let's assume you land on photography as your medium of choice. Before you go out and start taking pictures, you have to ask certain questions. What are the strong visual elements? When are things happening? That's a big one. What's the right visual approach? And we'll talk more about different types of photos like portraiture, candid, journalistic photography, still life, what have you. And to help in the planning process, you might think of it as sort of like a brainstorm. I don't make one of these for all the stories that I do, but it helps to separate topics out from your overarching subject matter, in this case like water quality. You think about smashing that topic into its different facets and then smashing those facets apart until you get down to the level of, say, like a tangible event that's happening next week where you can find people engaging with each other, having a good time, like a tree planting or a doctor's visit, volunteer opportunities, that sort of thing. So some of the types of photos, a big one and a great one to start out with if you're not familiar taking photos is a sense of place photo. That tends to be like a much wider shot. Portraiture, peak action, we'll get to some of these details is where you really focus in on something close up. And I don't think I'll have too many examples of non-literal photos, but you might think back to that photo of a mountain range by Ansel Adams or the shark caught in the net, and start thinking about the non-literal aspects, like the metaphorical aspects of a photo and how it makes you feel. So those are really challenging photos to make. And I had some examples, but I don't want to flip away from my PowerPoint, so bear with me. Practical tips for being in the field: get as far away as you can. That's how you get your sense of place photos. Get as close as you can. That's how you get your details. Fill the frame. That helps simplify compositions, and we'll go through some examples of that. Photography, it doesn't come when you want it to. You have to sit and wait for moments. Sometimes it's hours, sometimes it's weeks. Those great National Geographic stories that you see where like the animals are magically doing something amazing in front of the most amazing backdrop and with the most amazing light. Those can be weeks, waiting for the right thing to happen in the place that you want it. And while you're out, you're looking for emotion, relationships, and scale. So you don't want distracting backgrounds. You want variety as far as the distance to your subject. Again, talking about filling the frame. There's this idea of head size, and we'll get to this once we start looking at some photos. So visual variety is a really important concept in photography, and one of the shortcuts to getting a lot of visual variety in your in the photos that you make at an event or during the day is to look at head size. Like how big do people's heads literally appear in the frame of your photo? So you want, a mix of photos where people's heads are very big, very small because they're far away, and in between. Another note on exposure. So a quirk of how cameras tell how light or dark it is or what color a photo is supposed to be is that they think that everything that you pointed at will average out to a neutral gray. And what this means is that dark scenes like dark water will tend to get overexposed. Your camera will think it's too dark, I need to lighten it up. So it'll become this kind of grayish tone of water. Similarly with snow, it'll underexpose and you'll get gray snow. Photos with a lot of green in them, like if you're photographing a bunch of trees, it'll think, like there's too much green, it's going to add the opposite color, magenta, and you're going to get gray trees. So knowing these quirks will help you adjust things after you take the photos and during as well. So these are creative devices. I'm going to go through some photos now. It's going to get a little more exciting, hopefully. But you have things like rule of thirds is a big one. Lighting is a big one. Decisive moment, another great creative device. So the rule of thirds, first of all, it's not a rule. It's more of a guideline. But you literally divide a frame up into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, and you arrange elements of the photo either along those lines or at the intersections of those lines. So here, this waterman is at the intersection, the horizon is along one line, the basket of oysters is centered around another intersection. It makes it so that the subject of the photo, the waterman, is off to one side. And so he has space to look into the frame as opposed to being in the smack dab center, in which case he would be looking out of the frame. Here, we've used the rule of thirds again. You might recognize this is what we call a decisive moment. So, the photo of this lightning strike is a lot different than the photo, a second before or after when there's not the lightning in the photo. Another decisive moment, also another rule of thirds. With this bald eagle on the Anacostia. Another decisive moment, it's different photo when the hammer is raised in the air with a lot more tension than when it's laid down on the post after he's hammered it. Another device using a dominant foreground element, in this case the tractor and the man driving the tractor, and the contributing background. So having a strong foreground and background, it creates depth in the photo, and it makes your eye go back and forth and stay on the photo longer, which is what you want. Again, foreground, here it's foreground, middle distance, and background. So having those three layers in the photo, again, adds depth, complexity, which is great because you look at the photo longer, and the longer you look at a photo, the more you internalize it, remember the subject matter, and form an emotional reaction to it. Linear perspective, getting at that same thing, adding depth. The lines literally lead you into the center of the frame. Here you've got a good bit of light cast from the side. That adds an interesting element as well. Reflections add interest. Here there's also light at play, a little bit of the rule of thirds. And like I said before, lighting is one of the biggest ways you can create emotion in a photo, mood. One of the ways you get good light is you take photos at the very beginning of the day and at the very end of the day. They call it golden hour, which is the hour after sunrise or the hour before sunset. So this would be another kind of on the end of golden hour. So the light is coming from behind, it's creating a silhouette. There are also these leading lines leading you from one fisherman down to the other one at the end of the little pier. Framing doesn't have to be as literal as this example where it's a rectangular frame created by this little shack. It can be as simple as like some leaves that are sort of dark and out of focus in the foreground, leading you to the face of this this farm worker at this vineyard. And speaking of faces, I think above anything else, the human eye is drawn to faces. When you include them in photos, it's immediately more engaging, and you can that opens up possibilities as far as using a face to create a point of interest, and then adding contributing elements like the grapes in the foreground. Unique perspective, look up, look down, put your camera somewhere where you can't see something with your eye if you're just standing there. Doing just a little bit of effort to put your perspective somewhere where you don't usually see it can generate some interest. Again, getting in an airplane, I've had the opportunity to work with South Wings and Lighthawk, which are two organizations that they provide free flights for conservation purposes. Panning is a way to introduce motion into a photo, but still getting a sharp subject. In this case, it's this flock of geese, and you do that by slowing down your shutter speed. Selective focus removes distracting elements in the background. So in this case, the cars behind this motorcyclist could be, if they were in focus too, it'd be a lot more distracting. It'd be a lot harder to find the shape of this the cyclist as he goes through some nuisance flooding. Here, you don't have to see the water quality monitoring equipment in focus. It's much more interesting to see that face and then infer from the rough shape of the stuff. So here you have color. Your eye is drawn to changes in patterns in a photo. So here the overall pattern is yellow, so that spot of red really stands out. And you'll notice this photo also uses, it's good light. It's not the best, but rule of thirds, selective focus. You start to notice that using more than one creative device is a way to make photos more and more interesting. Juxtaposition is interesting because it's only one of the creative devices that really depends on your higher level thinking. So everything that I just described is more sort of your reptilian brain processing patterns, being attracted to, for example, like the highest point of contrast in a photo tends to draw your eye first. Faces draw your eye. Juxtaposition, on the other hand, you start to have to think about, okay, like how are, it's kind of silly to be kissing a fish, like that's a cultural understanding as opposed to sort of that, gut reaction. So those are creative devices. We talked about sense of place photos already, showing you, basically where your story is taking place. They tend to be wide shots. Details, they don't show you where you are. They're on the other end of the spectrum. They show things that maybe you don't see with your naked eye, or they frame things in a way that's unexpected. Filling the frame removes unwanted elements like a busy classroom, or really lets you focus in on the details again. So let's say you went out, you use your creative devices after planning ahead, and now you've got a good amount of photos. What do you do with them? You edit for visual variety and emotional impact. So if you take a typical set of photos that you took, if you don't do a great job like I did this day, they start looking very similar to one another, and that makes it very challenging to edit for a multi-picture package. Luckily, I shot a lot that day, and so with a level of editing, I really looked out for visual variety. You see I have different angles, a mix of sense of place, a mix of details, people interacting with each other, action, quiet moments. verticals, horizontals, and you start to get a sense of, a fuller picture of the day, and that makes it easier to combine images later on. So when you're going through choosing photos, you might get overwhelmed, but something called the photographic hierarchy is a way to prioritize photos and choose the most compelling photos. So you might think of informational photos being like, okay, this is what a stream looks like, in Pennsylvania or something like that. You're just standing there. You don't really add any art to the photo. Those are the basic period because they're the most common. They're also the least valuable in terms of visual storytelling. So the next step up, graphically appealing photos, that's when you start using your creative devices. You get close to the ground or high up in the sky and you get an interesting shot of that same stream. Emotional photos, maybe somebody is fishing in the stream and they are laughing, having a good time with their family, that sort of thing. And then at the very peak are intimate photos. If you think back to that photo of the hunter, it's where you're really in the subject's space and you feel like you're right there with them. You're living their life with them at that moment, and so you start to have the same emotional feelings that the subject has. So here, I'm maybe a foot away from this hunter. You can see the tension in his face as he's looking up. You start to imagine what it's like or what it feels like to be in that hunting blind. Another tip while you're editing, so we have this phrase, crop it until you break it. So what does that mean? So you've got a great photo of a bird, and it's okay. Like, it's a pretty nice moment, managing to catch a worm in midair. But the thing with, if you get a good exposure that's nice and sharp, pretty much with any camera, even a smartphone will let you crop into the photo because the resolution is higher. So we can go in a little tighter. It gets, proportionally, the energy of the photo is much more of the frame at this point. But even more so, going back to filling the frame, we can go from, a picture of a bird in a field to a picture of a worm against this bird, which has a lot more energy to it. So here's another take where I ended up with some visual variety. You can start to imagine, say, a wide shot of the stream pairing well with like a close-up of somebody pulling a plant out of a pot or some leaves for some nice visual variety. And this is another shot where I sort of did like a sample layout where you've got a wide shot pairing with a tight shot. And you'll notice that the tight shots, you can tend to run them smaller. Even though there's not a face in that lower photo, that would be considered a photo with a larger head size. So you can think of large head size can afford to be a smaller photo in your layout. Another great example, this is actually today's newspaper. You start to get a sense of that two-picture combo where you've got like a large wide shot and then a smaller, it's not a detail shot, but it's closer to a detail shot. It's sort of an environmental portrait of this scientist. And that sort of pairing you'll see a lot if you start paying attention in the newspaper. So I wanted to share some broad lessons that are learned from eye tracking studies. These are studies that, they hook people up to machines that let you tell where your eye goes on a page, whether it's a newspaper page or a website. Like I've been saying, people are drawn to faces, even in difficult scenes to read, like really busy photos. People ignore unrelated images. That's a big strike mark against using stock photos, and I'll show you an example of that on the next slide. People really recognize professionally made photos versus amateur photos. And captions, people will flip back and forth between a photo and the caption. And what that does, like some of the creative devices, is it leads you to look at the photo more, which is again what you want. You want people to linger, start forming memories, and getting an emotional response. So here's an example of like a poor use of a stock photo, not related to any of the text on the page, and in it, in this eye tracking study, people basically ignore it, even though there are faces in the photo. So the last note that I'll have is on photo ethics. So, along with the eye tracking research, other research shows that and it's kind of interesting that people will believe photos even if they don't necessarily believe this, the media source that those photos come from. So you might see the National Enquirer tabloid, at the supermarket checkout. Yeah, on one level, like, okay, it's the National Enquirer. I don't believe a word of this. But your brain seeing a photo of the Bat Boy being discovered, in New Jersey or something, your brain and its first instinct is to read that photo as true, and it's up to your brain after that to basically reject that truth. So there's this complicated stuff going on, and one of the things with photo ethics, aside from being truthful in the scenes that you represent, you might be tempted to stage something and say explain in the caption, for example, that okay, this was a staged scene. It doesn't quite work that way as far as ethically presenting a staged photo. Portraiture is one thing, but for example, if you made a photo illustration of something that didn't happen, you really have to go farther in the direction of making it clear that it's an illustration and not a photo. So an example of that is this National Geographic cover where they literally moved the pyramids closer together. This was at the very start of using Photoshop, so it was one of the first major flare-ups. I'm going to flip through. These are some other examples of poor choice of photo ethics. Marco Rubio used a photo of Canada to talk about America. Ocean Conservancy, this is one of the risks of social media, is not sourcing your photos accurately. They didn't make this photo, but they shared it, and it's this amazing moment where all these whales almost swallow a boat, but it's actually a Photoshop composition. And even though they explained on their Instagram account that it was fake, the comments kept on rolling in like it was a real photo. So that's one of the challenges. So we're getting close to 3 o'clock. I wanted to just flip through some pretty photos and leave you with a question of, what are some of the ways that you can show people in relation to their environment and, challenge people's preconceptions about, the Chesapeake Bay or their, neck of the woods. So that about wraps it up. I don't know if we have time for questions or if that's all we got time for. But thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Will. That was amazing, and I'm glad that we were able to get this all figured out technology-wise, and I think everyone still got to walk away with some really great information, and even, I know you didn't show as much photos as you wanted, but I think the ones you showed here were amazing. Does anyone have any questions on the phone or on the webinar platform? I have one, but I'll wait to see if anybody else wanted to share anything. I know, well, you can't see the comment box, but Ezra said he has to say that this is an incredible webinar and I'm loving it. Thanks so much. And Casey loves the fiddler crab photo. It's one of her favorites from the Elizabeth River, so she said thank you. So, any other comments or questions for Will?
I'll go back.
So I guess one question I had, so I know, for folks in our coalition, I think the thing is that, you're out in the field and you kind of have like your iPhone on you, and you're trying to snap a photo of a project or, some kids or families out planting trees and, you're hectic because you're helping, pass out materials and sign people in and you want to snap a few photos. So if there's just like one thing that you would recommend somebody just thinking about, like the most important thing, I know everything you mentioned is really important, but if there's just one thing that you could have people think about before they press the button on their phone, what would that be?
Well, The first thing I would say is to try and make taking pictures just like a matter of habit. It could be the first thing that you do when you get somewhere, even if there aren't people that show up yet. So two things come to mind. Using the rule of thirds is something that you can, that's something you can use in just about any situation that will help improve photos. And avoiding distracting backgrounds, which is a big thing at events, where you get a picture of somebody, but then there's another tiny person in the background sticking out of their head, or a tree that's coming out of somebody's head. Those are the first things that come to mind. And getting close, and getting close is another big one because it sort of solves other problems for you. When you get close and you fill the frame, the background goes away. Entirely, or it's thrown out of focus, and so that those distracting elements get reduced. So making a habit, getting close, I think that gets you all the way, and just focusing on faces is a big one too.
Awesome. Well, great. So it's 3 o'clock, so if no one has any other questions, I will say that Will is going to be leading a field trip at our conference this year. We're very excited about that. He's going to do a little bit of a similar presentation to what you guys just saw, maybe a little bit different, and then he's going to take everybody out around Lancaster, downtown Lancaster, to practice what that everyone just learned, and then maybe do a little debrief afterwards with everybody to give feedback and thoughts and lessons learned and things like that. So we're very excited about that, and so we hope that you guys can join us at the conference and learn even more from Will. So anything anyone wants to say before we jump off? All right. Well, great.
I want to make one more shameless plug.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I want to make one more plug for our photo archive on Flickr. Not only is it searchable and usable for pretty much any non-commercial use, which applies to pretty much everyone here. I can help you navigate that large archive, so that you might search on your own and not find what you need. But if you get in touch with me, I can possibly help you, point you in the right direction, and at the very least, it informs me as far as something that we might need in our archive in the future. So feel free to reach out. My contact information should be on here. So
I've used Will's photos multiple times before, and it's amazing. That archive, the Flickr archive is amazing. So please use it. Yeah, definitely. And thank you, Bree, for putting the Flickr link into the chat box. My assistant here. She's awesome. Well, great. Thank you guys so much, and we will be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day.
thank you, Kristen.